Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, so we are still working our way through asymmetrical synthesis of the sensible. This is our fourth video. Probably there will be 6, I think, videos in this for this chapter. So 2 more after this one. Today, let's just get straight into it with the first section, which is CARNOT'S and CURIE'S principles revisited. So if you remember at the start of this chapter, we talked about these 2 principles, CARNOT'S principle, which is the thermodynamic one, and CURIE'S principle, which was a principle of symmetry. And the original goal here was to extract a transcendental principle from these 2 empirical principles. And the reason, as far as I can tell, is that Deleuze is saying that on the empirical level, if we look at these, if we take these principles just at the empirical level, then they essentially just stand as 2 brute facts about the world. 2 things that are just principles, things that are true, but they lack a deeper kind of connection. They don't fit into any kind of broader picture. And that's what we're trying to do here, obviously, is understand reality itself, get a full metaphysical, or in this case, transcendental understanding of these concrete realities that we live, that we see, that we experience. And that's what part of what CARNOT'S and CURIE'S principles are. So we're looking for that the principles are like particular local rules. They apply in only specific domains, but that's the thing, like they have their own domains, symmetry and thermodynamics, but we're just looking for something that something big enough, an idea or a principle broad enough, big enough to encompass both of them, in which they can both appear as from which they can both arise out of. And that's this transcendental principle that Deleuze keeps talking about. So it arises, he says, by applying this extensive, intensive distinction to the concept of energy in general. And we've actually already talked about this when we first discussed CARNOT'S and CURIE'S principles, but kind of tangentially. We didn't hit it directly. So he says there are 2 ways to understand energy in general, or 2, if you like, 2 levels on which we can grasp, on which we can base our understanding of energy. The first is energy as extensity. So this is the empirical. This is what Deleuze says, the instance which governs a particular domain. So there's that idea, particular, local. These principles operate within only very specified local domains. And every domain is a qualified and extended partial system. So they're defined then by extension and quality, which we've already talked about a lot as those explicated intensities. When an intensity is explicated, it's explicated as extension and quality. And this produces what he calls the flat tautology of the identical. And this is that there is something which remains constant. And so identical, because constant, so that's how that connects. But also this idea of tautology. It's a tautology because there is something which remains constant. It's tautological because for there to be something, it would have to be constant. It would have to be what it is. It would have to be identical. There would have to be some element of sameness to it. So I like that, and that's this idea is going to be mirrored when we come to the transcendental principle. So just keep that in mind, the flat tautology of the identical. This is what understanding energy as extensity yields. And that tautology, there is something which remains constant. On the other side, then, we can view this as, we can understand energy as pure intensity, or what we've been calling an intensive quantity. And so this is, as opposed to the empirical, this is transcendental. And it's that which does not govern any domain, but gives the domain to be governed to a given empirical principle. It accounts for the subjection of a domain to a principle. So this transcendental principle doesn't hold in any specific local particular instance, any domain, but it's what allows that domain to emerge in the first place. It's what brings forth the domain, every domain, to start with. The domain is created by the difference of intensity. So it's the ground of the domain. It's the ground then of these empirical principles that science categorizes, that science looks for and codifies. So it's defined with the understanding energy as extensity was defined by extension and quality. Understanding it as pure intensity is defined in terms of difference. Fine. And this produces, and I like this produces the beautiful and profound tautology of the different. And that's obviously stands in distinction to the flat tautology of the identical. The beautiful and profound tautology of the different, which is difference of intensity. And again, why is this a tautology? We've talked about this before, because all intensity is fundamentally difference. All the elements, and intensity has two elements to it, and both of those elements are themselves defined by, they are both themselves intensive in nature. So they're composed, if you like, of two differential elements, and again, so on and so forth. We called that the what do we call it? The infinite doubling, I think, infinite doubling of disparity, something like that. But that's why it's a tautology. But just a really nice mirroring of the extensive half of this, the flat tautology of the identical, and the beautiful and profound tautology of the different. Love that. So this then gives us that deeper connection, that deeper grounding, that transcendental grounding in difference, from which, or on which, or in which, or embedded within these empirical principles can arise. And this is kind of what we did with entropy, if you remember. Was it in the last video? I think it was, where we showed that it only makes sense on the level of intensity. If you understand entropy from the perspective of difference, if you grasp it through that half of the site, through that deeper domain, that then entropy makes sense. Otherwise, if you remain on the level, I've called it, Deleuze doesn't call it a level, but that's kind of Bergson. I think I've mentioned that in the last video too. But if you remain on the level of extensity, the empirical, then entropy, it doesn't make sense, and it can't be explained. In order to fully see how entropy arises, you have to grasp this deeper transcendental principle, which is basically what we're doing here, moving from the extensive level to this more fundamental, intensive level. And that brings us to the second part of the video, which is the eternal return. So we'll start this section with a quote. The eternal return is not the return of the same, or of the similar, or the equal. It does not presuppose any identity. On the contrary, it is said of a world without identity, without resemblance or equality. It is said of a world the very ground of which is difference, in which everything rests upon disparities, upon differences of differences which reverberate to infinity, the world of intensity. So there's nothing really new here, just noting that, just connecting eternal return to this new understanding, this deeper understanding we have of difference as intensity, difference as implication, just bringing all of those together and pulling in the eternal return to that. So it's on this side of the divide anyway, as opposed to the empirical, extensive, the explicated side of things. And as we noted at the beginning, way back at the beginning of the series, we can nevertheless think one identity in the eternal return, but this identity only arises in the sense that it's the identical which is said of the different. So the eternal return is identical in the sense that it is essentially difference. Difference is what it's grounded in, it's based in. And to the extent that it is grounded in difference, that is the only identity that we can extract from this. The fact that it is said of difference. And another quote, Deleuze this time says that Nietzsche says, if there were identity, if there were an undifferentiated qualitative state of the world or a position of equilibrium for the stars, then this would be a reason never to leave it, not a reason for entering into a cycle. It is not a law of nature. The eternal return is elaborated within a ground or within a groundlessness in which original nature resides in its chaos, beyond the jurisdictions and laws which constitute only second nature. And so again, just fleshing out this idea a little bit more. If we start with uniformity, stasis, harmony, then nothing will happen. Then there's no impetus for change. There's no movement in this. There's no change. There's no development. There's no progress, and nothing would ever happen. So the fact that things happen, the fact that there is change, there is movement, tells us that the original, if you like, the state of reality can't be stasis or harmony, because then you need some kind of opposition, you need some kind of disequilibrium in order for something to happen, in order for change to come about. We need a sufficient reason. We talked about that before, which is exactly what Deleuze calls difference, and all throughout this book, and under a host of other names as well. But it's all grounded in this idea. The other thing that was interesting in that quote is where he says it's not a law of nature, eternal return. This eternal return that he keeps coming back to is not a law of nature. The reason is it grounds nature. It is what allows there to be a natural world in the first place, an empirical world, a world governed by these principles and laws. So it's not a law of nature because it precedes it, which, because it is chaos, however, because it's difference, it's the unequal, it's disparity, because it's all of these things, it's actually, instead of a ground, it's a groundlessness, because there's no order, there's no harmony, there's no stasis to the ground. And that's why Deleuze calls it, instead of a ground, it's a groundlessness. It's the base of it's the basis for the natural world, but that basis itself lacks any kind of harmony or order. So in that sense, he's reluctant to call it a ground. Hence, the word groundlessness. It's that which makes possible the ground of nature. And the other thing then that this means is that the laws of nature, the empirical principles that hold, are then derived. They're secondary. As Deleuze says there, the jurisdictions and laws which constitute only second nature. Second nature because the first nature, the originary nature, is this difference, fundamentally, this fundamental groundlessness of chaos. And just as a side note, he also connects the will to power here with difference, bringing it in, calling it the flashing world of metamorphoses, of communicating intentionalities, differences of differences. So the eternal return and will to power, Nietzsche all the way. Nietzsche, will to power comes in here as well as wrapped up in this this idea of difference. And it seems like there's there's a reasonable case to be made that will to power would align more with intensity as the kind of driving force that which allows the actualization of these ideas. But we'll come to that, the relation between ideas and intensities, in the last part of the video. But just before we leave this section, Deleuze also talks about, since the eternal return is originally in Nietzsche, it's like a test, right? If you can accept the doctrine of eternal recurrence, then you have overcome yourself. You've embraced life in its fullest, to the fullest degree possible. So there's this element of a test here, things that pass the test, things that don't pass the test. And Deleuze takes this idea up and says that what doesn't return, what doesn't pass Nietzsche's test here, Nietzsche's test interpreted through a Deleuzian lens at least, is are quality and extensity first, because within them difference, the condition of the eternal return, is cancelled. We talked about that a lot. Quality and extension cancel difference, so they don't pass the test of the eternal return. Another thing that doesn't pass the test is the negative. The negative, in the negative, difference is inverted and thereby cancelled, so that also doesn't pass the test. Another thing is the identical, the similar, and the equal. Another three things are the identical, the similar, and the equal, insofar as these all constitute the forms of indifference. So all opposed, anything opposed to this central idea of difference doesn't pass the test. And the last thing he mentions that doesn't pass is God, and also the self, but understood, these things as understood as the form and guarantee of identity. Anything that operates as a form or guarantee of identity doesn't pass the Deleuze's test here, because these things, God, for example, God and the self, they fix things as they are. God acts as a kind of guarantor for the world, making sure that, ensuring that everything is the way it is within this kind of harmonious, ordered totality. And the self does the same thing for individuals. It brings us into these, it orders who we are. It gives order to the entities that we are, to the beings that we are. And insofar as it does that, it covers over this original, more originary truth of difference. And insofar as it does that, it doesn't return. it doesn't pass Deleuze's test. Two things, however, which do pass the test, surprisingly a little bit, are quality and extensity. And we've already talked about the way that quality and extent, they were the first things we said don't pass the test. But Deleuze says there are two aspects, both of these characteristics, quality and extensity, they both have a double aspect. And it's the second aspect of both of them that does pass the test. So to quality first, the quality, he says, which flashes like a sign in the distance or interval created by a difference of intensity. And so I think the key there is flashes like a sign. And remember a few videos back we talked about quality being a sign, an indicator of the difference from which it sprung. And so I think that's what Deleuze is getting at here when he says this aspect of quality does pass the test, because it refers us back to this original difference, refers us back to that intensity out of which it was explicated. So that passes the test. The other quality, the other characteristic, extensity, that the second aspect of that also passes the test, in the sense that it's that extensity which remains implicated in the enveloping order of differences. So that's like the quote. And what I think this must be referring to is that distance and depth that we've talked about in this chapter. Extensity understood not as empirical extensity, but as that intensive quantity, that distance between the differential elements in the idea, that depth that arises from those. So it's that intensive extensity, if you like, and that does return, that does pass Deleuze's test here. Okay, and this brings us to the last part of the video, which is the relation between ideas and intensity. So ideas and intensity are very, very closely related. It's all about difference. We're all on that side of the equation. So what does Deleuze have to say? Ideas first. Let's take these. Ideas are problematic or perplexed virtual multiplicities made up of relations between differential elements. We've talked about most of that before. Ideas are problematic. They're virtual multiplicities made up of relations between differential elements. What we haven't talked about is this word perplexed, which did occur, but I didn't say anything about it. It was actually page 187 because I checked to mention it here. And what perplexed means is it's from the word perplication, which, if you remember in video 15, when we were in chapter 4, we talked about the three varieties of ideas. Those three varieties were ordinal, horizontal, and depth. And so the ordinal was understanding ideas by domain, breaking up ideas by the domain in which they arose. The horizontal was intra-domain, so within a single domain, understanding the relations and the elements that were a part of that. And depth was inter-domain, so relations with elements across different domains. And this interrelation of the types of ideas is perplication. So that's the word perplication. That's where Deleuze gets this word perplexed from. So when he says ideas are problematic or perplexed virtual multiplicities, that's all he means by that. That referring to that, the way that the elements within those ideas are connected in those different ways. So the root is perplex, but not as in, I think this is what he says, not as in doubt, hesitation, or astonishment, but connected more to the problematic nature of ideas. And that's why he chose the word perplex. So anyway, it's there, perplexed virtual multiplicities, from this word perplication. So if that's ideas, problematic, perplexed virtual multiplicities. Intensity, on the other hand, intensities are implicated multiplicities, implexes, made up of relations between asymmetrical elements which direct the course of the actualization of ideas and determine the cases of solution for problems. Okay, so intensities are implicated multiplicities. Implexes, this is another unusual choice of words. Implex, though, it comes from implicated, right? Just implicated, I guess the noun form of that. Implicated is the adjective, the noun is implex, and it's just kind of symmetrical with perplication and perplex. So they're implexes, they're implicated multiplicities, relations between asymmetrical elements, which direct the course of the actualization of ideas and determine the cases of solution. So that's important here. This is intensity is the way that it's the how of the actualization. It's the force that it's the motivating force for ideas to actualize. So it's like you've got the idea itself, which is made up, the virtual multiplicity made up of relations between differential elements, but we need something more in order for that to actualize. And when it does, when those differential relations are catalyzed, if you like, that's when they become implicated multiplicities. And this is all about now intensities. So now intensity is the driving force that is pushing those the relations between differential elements into the process of actualization. It's that which is stimulating the actualization. Intensity envelops distance with a view to actualization. I think that's how I've said this earlier in an earlier video. Intensity is kind of, and distance. I remember saying this with distance. Distance is like, or was it depth? I can't remember now. Distance, depth, implication, intensity, all of these enveloping, all of these words are connected with this catalyzation of ideas into this process of actualization. And the other thing that was important here in that quote is asymmetrical, because this is the title of the chapter, and so it's worth dwelling on this for a little bit. The implicated multiplicities, they're made up of relations between asymmetrical elements. The ideas, when we were talking about ideas, there were relations between differential elements. And now we're moving to talking about relations between asymmetrical elements. And the way I understand this is that in the idea, we're grasping the idea as it is prior to any kind of actualization. But once this process of actualization is kind of is being kicked into gear, then we get it's the same. They're the same elements, but now that they have they've gone through that phase of reciprocal determination, now they actually exist as elements, whereas prior to this this quickening, this catalyzation, they were just virtual. They were virtual elements. Now they've become elements that stand in contradistinction to each other. So now I think this is why the change of term to asymmetrical, from differential elements to asymmetrical elements, because now there is this more determined, definite dissymmetry between the two. Whereas prior to this, when the idea was just an idea, it was virtual. Nothing had been, it was still indeterminate. Now it's been determined, it's gone through that second, if you remember the three phases of the ideas, or three movements, I think we talked about in the ideas. The second one was reciprocal determination, and that's the stage in which the elements become elements for the first time. And that's what I think warrants this switch to the word asymmetrical. So yeah, they're asymmetrical, and this is connected as well with what we said about ordinality, ordinal versus cardinal numbers. There's an intrinsic meaning to the relation between ordinal numbers as opposed to cardinal numbers, which just mark a place. So there is this arising of meaning in the distance between two elements. And there's a directionality as well. There's an asymmetry, and it's this which we are calling intensive or intensity. So that's the main idea here. Ideas are problematic or perplexed virtual multiplicities made up of relations between differential elements. Intensities are implicated multiplicities, implexes, made up of relations between asymmetrical elements. And the intensities direct the course of the actualization of ideas, determine the cases of solution for problems. Okay, nice. The other thing that is interesting to note with regards to this distinction is that ideas are dialectic. And remember, dialectic describes the way that ideas are problematic. They're problems and questions, understood as problems and questions, right? And that's how Deleuze describes it. He actually brings in another word here to describe this, which is irony. So irony, he said, understood as the art of problems and questions, is expressed in the handling of differential relations and in the distribution of the ordinary and the singular. So, okay, irony. I mean, you can see he's bringing these terms in, and presumably this is from Kierkegaard, irony. But yeah, irony is the art of problems and questions, maybe. Dialectic, I think, is definitely holds with this, problems and questions. There's a sense of dialectic to that. Okay, irony, it's there. But this is connected with differentiation with a T, right? So that's the idea, and the corresponding half with intensity is the aesthetic. So we've got the dialectic of ideas and the aesthetic of intensity. And the aesthetic of intensities, Deleuze describes as humour. So again, the Kierkegaardian connection seems prevalent here. Humour, a physical art of signals and signs, determining the partial solutions or cases of solution. In short, an implicated art of intensive quantities. And again, humour here, is that really what we mean when we say humour? Can we stretch humour to mean a physical art of signals and signs, determining partial solutions? I don't know. It seems a little bit forced to me, that one. Irony and humour. Okay, it's there, whatever. Dialectic and aesthetic, I think that's better. And the intensity here, the aesthetic of intensity is differentiation with a C. So that's the connection with actualization. So ideas are kind of metaphysical bedrock, if you like, and then intensity is the same thing. It's talking about ideas as well, but ideas as being catalyzed in this process of actualization. Ideas as they are being differentiated with a C. So the idea incarnates itself in differentiated qualities and differentiated extensities. The relations coexisting within the idea differentiate themselves in qualities and extensities because of intensive quantities. That's just kind of what I think is going on here, just a summary sentence. Which leads me to a quote. Intensity is the determinant in the process of actualization. It is intensity which dramatizes. It is intensity which is immediately expressed in the basic spatiotemporal dynamisms and determines an indistinct differential relation in the idea to incarnate itself in a distinct quality and a distinguished extensity. And I think that's just putting the finer point on everything that I've been trying to explain with regards to the difference between ideas and intensity. And if you remember, this is what we ended chapter 4 with. We were looking for that potentiality which grounds dramatization, which grounded that spatiotemporal, the drama of spatiotemporality, and that which grounds this dramatization has turned out to be intensity. Intensity, which is expressed in spatiotemporal dynamisms, determines an indeterminate differential relation, and incarnates or explicates as quality and extensity. And the other thing, a couple more things to note about that is that intensity creates the qualities and extensities in which it in which it explicates itself. Man, that's a real, you can't get those wrong, right? If you get those around the wrong way, the whole thing collapses. Intensity creates the qualities and extensities in which it explicates itself, because the latter, the qualities and extensities, they don't resemble the ideal relations which are actualized in them. And we have talked about that before. I remember saying something about this. The relations between the ideas and the elements in the idea are different from, they're totally different from the concrete realities that form. They're different in kind. That there's no resemblance there. Which would be the case if we were talking about representation, a concept being connected with an empirical reality. There is a one-to-one identical relationship there, but that relationship doesn't exist here. Sameness is out, right? It's all difference. So because the concrete realities, that the extensities and the qualities which are actualized are different from the relations within the idea which they are the actualization of, then there is a process of creation. There is an act of novelty here coming about. And so that's what Deleuze means when he says that intensity creates the qualities and extensities in which it explicates itself. There's a There's a genuine act of creation in this, a genuine act of novelty. However, of course, intensity doesn't create qualities and extensities or explicate itself the way that we normally think of with a conscious subject, for example. But it's more, the way I think of it is more like a driving force, or what I was saying before, a catalyst operating within the idea, a catalyst that drives that process of actualization, of differentiation with a C. So how does it do this then? How does intensity determine the movement of actualization like this? The answer to that is individuation, and that is where we are going to start in the next video, which means we are up for a summary now. So first of all, we talked about Carnot's and Curie's principles, revisited, and we were looking for a transcendental principle. That was the idea, a transcendental principle which can ground these different empirical principles which operate in localized domains only. And we found that in this idea of an energy in general as an extensive intensity. So on the empirical side, we have extension and quality, and we call this the flat tautology of the identical. But on the transcendental side, we have difference, and this resulted in the beautiful and profound tautology of the different. And this transcendental principle, this understanding of energy as extensive intensity, that gives us this deeper principle out of which the empirical principles can arise. Then we looked at the eternal return. Not a huge amount of new material here, but we just emphasized that this is placed on the difference or intensive side of the divide. We also noted that this was necessary, this eternal return, because without it, if we start with uniformity, stasis, harmony, if we don't have this movement originally possible, we don't have a difference which could generate any kind of movement or change, then nothing will ever happen. And we also connected the will to power here with difference, just bringing in that, and I mentioned that maybe the will to power fits in more naturally with intensity, as opposed to the difference, the relations between differential elements that make up the idea. And that was the last part of the video, which was the relation between ideas and intensity. So ideas, problematic or perplexed virtual multiplicities made up of relations between differential elements. This was dialectic, it was ironic, and it was also connected with differentiation with a T. And this was contrasted with intensities, which are implicated multiplicities or implexes made up of relations between asymmetrical elements. And that word asymmetrical was important because it's the heading of the title, it's the heading of the chapter, and it related to the relations between elements in the sense that they have been reciprocally determined at this point, and we've entered, if you like, the phase of actualization. Intensities are aesthetic, they were humorous, and connected with differentiation with a C, or in other words, actualization. Intensities are the potentiality which grounds the spatiotemporal dramatization. So that just connected us to what we were looking for at the end of chapter 4. And we're going to look at exactly how intensity does this, how intensity does determine the movement of actualization in the next video. And that's us for another video. Done. So hopefully that helped, as always, and thanks for watching. We'll see you next time around.